So I've been asked to make some comments to sort of wrap this all up. So first comment is a big thank you to so many of you. Thank you, Father Goody and your parish here of St. Francis of Assisi in East Palo Alto. I'm so happy to say this is my first pastoral activity as the Archbishop of San Francisco is coming here to be with you at this parish. Thank you for hosting this, and thank you to your parishioners. Thank you, all of you, for being here. Thank you especially to our speakers. Your very moving sharings. Pastor Baines, I'm so happy you're here. This is, I think, a very good occasion for us to meet for the first time. So I'm really, really happy that you're here with us and spoke with us. And Councilman Moody also, thank you for being here. I see my old friend and brother, Walter Hoyt, joined us. So thank you, Walter, for being with us as well. And to all of you and all of our speakers. So this issue of racism is such a thorny and vexing issue in the United States. And I think our country really consists of lots of lights and shadows. What I see in the news and what I hear on the radio, I get the impression that we have two very different camps. One camp that would see the nation as founded on evil and everything about it is evil, and another camp that sees us as the greatest nation on the face of the earth that ever was and ever will exist, and would, if not ignore, at least downplay the shadow side of our history. I myself have more recently come to understand more clearly the shadow side and the evil parts of the history of the United States and how deep that evil is, and I must admit it's very disturbing to me. But still, I would encourage us all to try to see the bigger picture, that it consists of lights and shadows. Let's not deny that there are great things about our country, but there are some evil parts and some ongoing oppression that we need to address. I think of my own, so I'm going to just share some ideas with you of my own perspective on my own reflection and what's come from my study, discussion with others, and learning from others. This is not certainly the final word. Not everything I say might be completely accurate, although it's my honest assessment, and I'm going to speak a lot from my heart. I'm going to be very open and vulnerable with you, but it's for the purpose of beginning a discussion. There's some really important ideas we need to keep in mind to begin a discussion to try to arrive at solutions. I think that every group that's come here from outside the country has suffered some form of discrimination. Anyone who did not come from the cultural milieu with which the country was born. We usually call that WASP, but it has a negative connotation. I don't mean it with a negative connotation, but the country basically was founded mainly by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants with very high ideals, very noble aspirations. So I'm affirming the principles with which this country was founded, and I'm expressing gratitude to those who founded it. But immigrant groups have all experienced some form to some degree of discrimination. My own grandparents immigrated from Italy. So they were part of the waves of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, mainly Catholics and Jews. They experienced discrimination too. Italian immigrants were poorly treated. But we eventually were able to achieve the American dream. We were able to work out of that, and now my generation was the first one to go to college. My father was able to get a good job, support our family. Now our generations has gone to college. So we're able eventually to assimilate and avail ourselves of the blessings of this country. But in my own estimation, there are two groups that have been especially oppressed and kept down. It seems like each group kind of oppresses or discriminates against the next group down. Those who have been kept consistently at the bottom, in my own opinion, are the only two groups who did not come here of their own free will. Those who did not come here because they were already here, the indigenous Americans, and those who did not come of their own free will, the slaves who came from Africa and those who descended from them. So my own way of thinking is because of what we call systemic racism. We use this term a lot, and I would encourage we engage in discussion as to what that really means. So I want to offer you my own insights. Again, these aren't the only insights. We need other people's opinions and insights. But in my own way of thinking, systemic things have changed on paper. I think paper and the laws and policy and so forth looks pretty good. But systemic racism in my own mind are cultural attitudes that get so ingrained that it blinds the people in the group that have the advantage to the injustices they are inflicting on those who do not have that advantage, and justifies it and would punish anyone who would speak out against it. So we see this especially in the African American community, and I think it really does go back to the era of slavery. If we think what slavery did to the African American family, breaking up the family, and have been struggling with that all along. It's these kind of cultural attitudes that could blind people in the South from the evil of lynchings. I mean, that's absolutely abominable. It's unthinkable nowadays. How could that have happened? Even public lynchings. And those who would try to advocate for civil rights, who at great risk to themselves, and of course the great hero, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, but others too, who suffered violence for advocating against that. It's these cultural attitudes that blind people to the evil that is being perpetrated. So I'm going to get very vulnerable with you now and say things that might make some of you uncomfortable, or you might even disagree. But again, it's for the purpose of initiating a conversation about it. What are those attitudes today that prevail, that are keeping our African American brothers and sisters down? Slavery broke up the black family, and then Jim Crow laws oppressed them for another 100 years. In 1965, those of you my age and older might remember what they called the Moynihan Report, issued in 1965. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, at the time, was President Johnson's Associate Secretary of Labor. He was a sociologist by education, then went on to become the great esteemed Senator of New York. So he issued they call it the Moynihan Report. The official title was, well, in the language of the day, the State of the Negro Family in America. So he was sounding warning bells at the time about what was happening in the African American family, because 25% of the children were being born out of wedlock. So these children were growing up without fathers, and he was making the connections between that and their being trapped in poverty. And he said, if this continues, it's going to be disastrous for the African American community, and we need to do something to turn this around. Just the year before, the Civil Rights Act was passed. So to me, this is the very unpleasant irony. Right at the time African Americans got full equality in the law, was at the time somebody took notice of this. But what happened was, with all of those social revolutions in the 60s and the sexual liberation, it ended up not correcting the problem, but spreading it to all communities in our country and exacerbating it, and wreaking havoc on the family all throughout the country. So the African American community were especially vulnerable to this, to the point that now 75% of African American children are born out of wedlock. What else is related to this? I'm sorry that I'm being very vulnerable here. And it's hard to say, but it needs to be said. I think about how Planned Parenthood targets black communities. I read recently, I would need to do some fact checking, but this something I read just recently claims that about half of their clinics are in black or brown communities. It's to the point that now about half of pregnancies of black women end in abortion. It's even worse in New York City, it's more than half. So if this continues, the race is on track to be eliminated. And yes, it does kind of fit the idea of Margaret Sanger, the foundress, who was well known as eugenicist. But I'm not saying it's because the people who run these clinics have it in their mind the black race needs to be eliminated. I don't think it's because of that. Systemic racism is more complex, more insidious even. I think it comes from this attitude that's gone back very far in the history of our country that black people are disposable. They're disposable so we can enslave them. They're disposable so we can lynch them. They're disposable so we can keep them down by Jim Crow laws. That Jim Crow era could produce something like, I don't know if any of you are aware of this film, Birth of a Nation. I heard about it, I finally braced myself to watch it because I was curious. It's a film about the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, who are the heroes in the story. Now that the slaves are free, they have to save our country from black people taking over. They're disposable, so we can have an atrocity such as the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment. Not the Tuskegee Airmen. This is where I see lights and shadows, right? We had the Tuskegee Airmen, the first military pilots, who fought with valor and became heroes in service to their country. But there was also the Tuskegee Syphilis experiment, which used black men, unbeknownst to them, as specimens on experiments to cure the disease. So it's this attitude of black people being disposable that, again, and it's more unwitting, I think, sometimes explicit, but it's systemic because it's so deep in the cultural attitudes. I think another element in this is, and some of you have spoken about this is one that's more immediately obvious, is the issue of education. So many of our schools in the inner city neighborhoods are failing. Why is that? We need not just to invest resources, but more creative ideas. I think, Councilman Moody, when you were talking about building up relationships for the trust factor, when you were saying that, this clicked in my mind, is we need solutions like that for our schools to build up that trust, build up a sense of community. We need to address the problem of education. So how do we go about fixing this? These, in my own estimation, are getting to the root of the problem. Well, look to what some social science researchers have told us. Now, these are not people who are necessarily observant religious people. They're certainly not theologians or clergy. These are social science experts just approaching their science from their own principles. They speak about the sequence of success. I had read about this and learned a little bit about it. Then a couple of years ago, I came across an op-ed piece in the New York Times by George Will about it. In fact, I remember exactly when it was because I was giving a talk about a week later that this article related to media too. I was able to use it. So this was in July of 2018. The sequence of success. He said that what they have studied and concluded is success is if people do these things in the right order. Graduate from school. That means we need good schools for them to graduate from. Get a stable job. So we need an economy that will support stable jobs that can earn an income to support a family. Then get married. So we need to form our young people with the virtues they need to be able to get married and stay married, and then have children. So they did a study on people who followed this sequence of success. And do you know how many of those people ended up in poverty? What percentage? 1%. So this is a formula that is 99% effective. Now again, I'm not getting political here. The closer I'll get to being political is to say that both of our major political parties have principles that support this idea. So I would hope there'd be some way to engage the political process to help our young people get on track to follow this sequence of success. So we are here to listen. I think that's so important that we listen, and Pastor Baines, you were talking about that. We need to listen to stories and learn from one another. This is my vision in building up these listening sessions. I'm convinced, I've experienced, and I'm convinced that we need to hear each other's stories and understand each other's perspectives, because I don't know the perspective that, Dara, thank you for your very brave sharing. I don't know what that's like growing up in an inner city neighborhood, being shot at, running away, and someone next to me, my friend next to me, falling. I don't know what it's like growing up as a child in an inner city neighborhood and the fear and sense of resentment upon seeing the police. I don't know what that's like. I need to hear what that's like. I also, on the other hand, I don't know what it's like to be a police officer who has to make a split-second life and death decision. Not that all police brutality is a bad decision at a split second. We have some horrendous examples where it was not a split-second thing, where George Floyd is the most notorious example. It was something that was very intentional. But often they have to make these split-second decisions, and I don't know what's running through their mind. What are the consequences if they go one way or the other? Loss of life, loss of livelihood. I don't know what that's like. We need to hear each other's stories. And I'm so happy to hear that it's worked. Pastor Baines, you were sharing that. When you hear each other's stories, how it builds up trust and builds up community. Councilman Moody also, but I'll just say I've been in conversation over the years with pastors from the Church of God in Christ, and I realized that you're people of action. We Catholics like to think, but Kojic gets things done. So you have realized the vision that I have in starting out these listen sessions, so thank you. It's my real hope that as we continue this, we will do exactly that, what you've been talking about. Build up relationships, build up trust across lines of people who maybe would not listen to each other or interact so much. So much changes when we understand the world from the other's point of view. It's not a matter of beating people over the head to get them to think the way that we think. No, we just want to try to see the world through the eyes of the other. And that's what builds up the trust that you were talking about. And I'm so happy to see the fruits of it here in East Palo Alto, how you've been peacefully demonstrating in the midst of all violence is happening elsewhere. It's really, really encouraging to me, and it tells me that we're on the right track with what we're about here. So I'm very much hoping for building this sense of community and trust, and hopefully from that coming up with some practical solutions. Thank you for sharing the one about the National and the California Police Activities League. So this is something definitely worth looking into. So I want to just conclude with a little personal sharing. Those of you who know a little bit about my background know that I've been a lifelong aficionado of jazz. I don't know where that came from. All I know is when I was old enough to be aware of it, I knew I loved that form of music. I love the jazz beat. I love the look and the sound of all of that brass. It's something that just captivated me, which is why I took up the saxophone as a youngster. The more I learned about the music, though, the more I appreciated what a brilliant art form it is. But then I studied more about kind of the more musicological side, its origins and its cultural origins. How it was a fusion of the work songs of the slaves in the fields and the Negro spirituals with European musical forms, meshing those African harmonies and rhythms with the European musical form. It's no surprise to me that jazz was born in New Orleans, because jazz is basically gumbo and sound. So when I have reflected on it more, especially with the questions we're dealing with now, I'm amazed. This joyful music that has come from such an oppressed people. And it makes me appreciate tremendous cultural contributions that African Americans have made to our country. A whole new genre of music that wouldn't have existed before. The United States would not be the same without these cultural contributions. It tells me so much of the resilience of the African American community. You are still here, you're still persevering. We're so happy to be with you, and we love you, and I really, really hope that together we can finally put an end to the scourge that has been a part of our country for so long. So thank you for your commitment and your presence here today.